Recording in progress.
Okay, so we got our 3 Dharma seals there in front of us. And I'm going to do my presenter review. Cool. Now, the 3 Dharma seals there you see is impermanence, non-self, and nirvana. Why are these called the seals? We can almost think of them as anytime the Buddha has given any type of teaching or lecture throughout his life, say a sutra, they tend to be associated with these three factors here. So almost think of it as if a sutra was written in a letter and it was put into an envelope, it would be sealed with at least one of these 3 aspects. Now this last one, nirvana, used to be suffering. In some traditions it still is labeled as suffering. But if you remember when we talked about Nagarjuna, he had changed it from suffering to nirvana because he didn't feel like suffering was the correct way of understanding it. It would help if one were to help a student understand that suffering is merely a gateway towards enlightenment or nirvana, because through suffering, if you remember from our first Sunday lecture, through suffering we find our way towards understanding, and the understanding is such that nirvana is found, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. We'll get there. So let's start with impermanence. So from the point of view of time, we're being grateful for the present moment experience before it's gone, not getting lost in the anxieties and worries about the future or regrets or fear that comes from the past. But recognizing the impermanence of things, that things are always changing, and it's all too easy to project the fears of the past onto the present moment to the point where you create limiting beliefs that shut doors of opportunities for you to establish deeper relationships with people, because fear tends to take you out of it, the fear of repeating the past. But rather recognizing that every situation, every person is fresh, new, not everything is the same as it was, that all is impermanent, constantly changing, never a permanent thing. What makes us suffer is wanting permanence when all is subject to change. So sometimes we tend to grasp after things and want it to be permanent because it brings us a sort of temporary joy, if you will, a crutch. So it works both ways. Sometimes we want to escape pain by thinking that there are some aspects of pain that are permanent and that will constantly arrive and haunt us. And the other side of it is wanting to be permanent things that provide us that quick dopamine hit. Things that might seemingly give us value in society, in status, material possessions, and then when those things are gone, or perhaps we lose it all in a Great Depression or a recession, then you start to wonder why even live at all, because what you had thought had given you happiness is now gone. So we constantly cling on to these things. And yet they're all subject to change. Things degrade over time, the body ages, and yet look how hard we try, often in society, particularly here in America, to try to make permanent the young age and how we look. Try to get rid of those wrinkles, the gray hairs. Try to escape change, when it is in fact inevitable. It can never be escaped. But yet impermanence makes transformation possible. This is the good news. Impermanence is the good news, because transformation is possible. Which means, even in the midst of great suffering, we can help transform that suffering with our actions, words, and deeds in order to help happiness, gratitude, and peace blossom in even the most darkest of moments. When you're in an argument with someone, Thich Nhat Hanh suggests closing your eyes for a moment and visualizing that the both of you are 300 years older from now. Where would you be? Perhaps buried in the ground somewhere. And so it helps to look into the distant future and then look back. And you'll see this in people who, start approaching the end of their life and they look back and regret because they had perhaps overlooked the potential for acceptance of another person, acceptance of the way that things just happen to be, and allowing that love and that blossom to joy and to blossom in that moment, rather than getting stuck in their own opinions and ideas of how things ought to be or should be. And so they lose that opportunity to deepen a relationship with somebody. Instead, burn as many bridges as possible. When in fact we could appreciate life as it is here in this moment before it's gone, which inevitably it will be. So acknowledge the preciousness of our relationships, because you never quite know how long a person or you will be around. And this idea of being and non-being, or being alive or being deceased, they're just notions. And yet nothing is ever lost. Nothing is ever gained. And we'll talk more about why that is in non-self. So in non-self, this means that nothing has a separate existence. There is no permanent self or entity. And this is a controversial topic to some, but in Buddhism, this concept of anatman, which is that there is no self, there is no soul that gets transferred from one being to another, or gets transported to a realm beyond this one, be that heaven or hell or hungry ghosts or whatever it might be. But rather, this body, this being, simply arises when the causes and conditions are sufficient in the world, in our ecosystem. And then once this body ages and starts to decay, then everything that makes it up goes back into the ecosystem from whence it came. From dust we arise, and dust we shall return, right? And yet we cling to the idea that there is this permanent self, this personality that we've forged over the years will continue on after this physical body has decayed and went back into the earth. And where does it go? Where is it inside of us? Can't quite locate it. Although in the Upanishads it says that there's a soul, a little flame that resides in a small chamber of the heart. They try to locate it there. If you dissect the heart, it might be a little harder to find. So this is why the Buddha had strayed away from superstitious beliefs, instead relied more on just scientific method. If you find it, you see it, and it's there. And yet even that is deceiving, because what might appear as an object in the given moment, it could turn into something else later on, right? So we have to be careful about visualizing a permanent structure that could be a quote-unquote self or a soul, because people attach all sorts of meanings to that. In Indian culture, throughout Hindu society, the idea of the caste system. Your soul goes into a certain being in the next life based on your previous karma. So we attach karma to the soul, and then that karma determines what type of being you're going to be in your next life, and how you got to pay up and the reparations required for you to make up for the misdeeds of your past lives, and it gets all sorts of messy, right? So we attach all these meanings to this idea of this permanent self, right? And that's where things get really icky, because now you have a whole class system where people pretend to be of a higher being than somebody else, right? And so the Buddha wanted to stray away from that notion, that idea. So when nothing has a separate existence and all is dependent on everything else, this comes from the point of view of space. We talked about time and impermanence. Now we're talking about space. I'm being grateful for all the causes and conditions that make creation possible. This body is a part of a larger living entity. So we think of this body as like this separate thing, and yet actually our existence is dependent on more than just this body. It's part of everything else. All that stuff outside of you, that's part of your body. That ecosystem, the living, breathing planet Earth, is an extension of your existence and your body. And to think that these two are separate things is an illusion. It's what we would call ignorance. Okay? So there's a level of gratitude here that we can touch into at any given moment, even in very difficult times. There is that gratitude there, that the causes and conditions on the planet are such that this human being is able to exist in this moment. So we can be grateful for that. There's a story of the cookie dough and developing discriminative perception, where there's a bit of a story in the book, and it's like how one cookie is formed into a different shape than the other, and they think that they're like, oh, we're different cookies. And yet, really, they were just shaped just a little differently, right? This is where we go back into the idea of the whole, like, human beings placing one type of group of human beings over another, and we see that recur again and again in society. But really, we're all just cookie dough, right? And it's easy to forget that we have so much in common and similarities in genetics and DNA, but we focus so much on the differences between us. This is discriminative perception. And it will blind you to the point where you will allow the conditions of anger and hatred to arise because you focus so heavily on the differences between you and others. And this insight reminds us that everything belongs to the same stream of life. And the third one here, when we talk about nirvana, we were trying to describe that as best as we could in the previous classes, with exactly what is nirvana. And here we're talking about the suchness of things, the ground of being, the ultimate reality. We talked about absolute reality as opposed to like historical. So when we touch into ultimate reality, or the suchness of things, it is the extinction of all concepts and notions, even Buddhist ones. Now, Buddhist notions and concepts could help us on the path towards this type of realization, but eventually, even these we have to let go, because they can cloud the mind if we cling too tightly to them. And Master Lin Chi had this type of insight because many of his students would come to him and ask him about certain concepts and ideas related to Buddhism, and he would, maybe in a sarcastic way, say things like, "Oh, that's a pile of poop." Or he would shout at them, or maybe slap him across the face, which would seem appalling. But what he was trying to do was get people to get outside their heads and not attach to concepts and notions related to Buddhism, right? Because he could see that they were trapped, and he was trying to help them get out of the trap. So the extinction of concepts and notions, even Buddhist ones, because they can prevent us from touching reality as it is. Instead, we try to overlay reality with a certain belief structure, categorize it, put it into a box or several boxes to no end, until we've completely lost the ability to see reality for what it is, its complexities, its beauty. We'll talk about signs a little bit more in the next slide. How signs prevent us from touching reality, the suchness of things, the primordial soup. Einstein talks about E equals mc squared, this transference of the dance between energy and matter. And given the right conditions, energy will give rise to matter, and when matter dissipates, now energy dissipates along with it. So this back and forth dance between energy and matter. So it's being able to touch that suchness, that there's particles, there's energy all floating about around us at any given moment. And they give rise to matter when the conditions are right, and then they just go back to where they came. Back into the ethers to continue the dance. This is the theater of life. That's the suchness of things. But our fear of death is rooted in our illusory idea of what death is. Instead, try to contemplate the continuation of phenomena in various forms of creation. I've planned it out such that when my body dies, it's going to go to the Pacific Northwest, and it's going to be placed into a composting bin device where it eventually becomes part of the soil. And they introduce soil into it, right? Put bacteria in it, and eventually eats away at the body, and it becomes this compost. Compost to be used to grow other things, be that flowers or trees. I put it in my will that I want my compost, although that's not really mine, it's just compost, right? Because I'm no longer here, but I mean, I'm there. I'm here, but not there. Anyway, so the compost goes into the ground, into a hole, and I want a Texas mountain laurel to be planted in that hole. Now, why a Texas mountain laurel? Have you ever seen a Texas mountain laurel? It blooms purple flowers, and they're gorgeous, and it smells like grape soda. It's wonderful. And it's incredibly toxic, so you can't eat it. So, it's one of my favorite trees. And I thought, what a great idea to just demonstrate impermanence and the continuation of phenomena in various forms of creation by being the compost that gives life to this tree, and then on it goes, right? The cycle continues. Now, the Dharma seals are the keys to opening the 3 doors of liberation. Now, you'll see that emptiness is very closely related to impermanence and non-self, because the idea of emptiness is that all things are empty of a separate, independent self. It does not mean non-existence or nihilism, often confused with nihilism, but rather that things exist differently than how we typically perceive them to be. Emptiness is just the middle way between existence and non-existence. That humans are made of non-human elements. So if we destroy the environment, then we destroy ourselves. So we learn to see ourselves in the things outside of the body in order to dissolve this false boundary. I had heard that Michael Stone, who was a Buddhist teacher for a period of time in Toronto, Canada, really enjoyed his lectures. He passed away a couple years ago due to a drug addiction, no less. But he once gave a lecture about emptiness and shunyata. And I really like how he described shunyata. So the way he described it was that it means almost like an overwhelming pregnancy. That you're so full of life that there's nothing that you could really call or distinguish from anything else. There's too much life in it. So look at this body and everything that makes it up. The bacteria, the neurosynapses and pathways, the blood cells coursing throughout the body every day. There's so much life in this body, you almost can't really even see the body. Think of it that way, right? There's just too much going on here. There's nothing that you can distinguish separate from anything else because there's so much contributing to it. The air that we breathe that comes into our lungs, the food that we eat. There's so much life in this body that it's empty. Learn to see yourself in the things outside yourself. Maintain this awareness. We will know what to do and what not to do with that awareness. So it gives perspective about how to continue about your life in a way that you can make decisions not based on delusions of grandeur, fame, fortune, but rather how to touch life deeply. There's a story in the book about how Thich Nhat Hanh was in Canada, eating with the Sangha, and a student looked up at him and said, "I am nourishing you." Now, I admit, when I first read that sounded a little creepy to me. If I was eating lunch with somebody and there's somebody across from me, I was like, "I'm nourishing you," I'd be like, "All right, that's a little weird." But to Thich Nhat Hanh, this was deep insight, right? Because even though he was eating from his bowl, there was a student who was like, "I am nourishing you," because they're nourishing each other, right? It's not us just eating. Like, we're all nourishing each other in one degree or capacity. Even just being in the presence of another life form. What type of nourishment is that? We talk about the 4 kinds of nutriments, right? And the things around you nourish you to some capacity. And then signlessness. Think of the shape of water, how the water changes. When we call something water, we have a certain idea of it that rises in the mind. And yet water has various different forms that it can take in any given moment, whether it be a cloud in the sky, a river, an ice cube. But true water is just the suchness of water, made of non-water elements. Nothing can be described by just one sign, one name of things. So until we can break through these titles, these names or labels, we start to see the ocean in the sky, right? The transformation of things, the cycle. And then we start to touch reality as it is. We see, label, and judge prisoners, but if we look deeply, we are just as much imprisoned as they are. And why? It's because we are co-responsible for their suffering due to the kind of culture and society that we continue to support that contributed to the unskillful behavior of that individual. And as a book from Gabor Mate, you might have heard of, he's sort of a leading expert on trauma today. He has a book called The Myth of Normal that I'm reading right now. It's a fairly large book, but it has some good insights. The myth of normal is that what we perceive as normal in our own culture and society is actually supporting a continuation of trauma, pain, and suffering amongst individuals. And we think it's normal, and yet what we do is people who are in deep pain and suffering, we tend to lock away as if there's something wrong with them. It's like, oh, they're just not accepting what's normal. They aren't accepting the system, so we need to lock them away. Right? They've failed. They failed to be successful, to adapt. What really happened is that they are often a victim of the circumstances that they were born into. They've adapted certain behaviors and habits that weren't even their own. Beliefs about themselves, their relationships, and society in general. That's crafted the kind of person that they became. So, is locking them away in a cage the right answer? We support this system. Are we not responsible as well? They're a part of our civilization, our society. They aren't a failure. What they're struggling with is a key indicator. Their suffering is a key indicator to understanding where we've gone wrong and how we can help ourselves heal. When we talk about generational trauma, that's a part of it. So we need to focus more on rehabilitation, helping this person out, helping them deal with their generational trauma, trauma they've experienced in their own lives. It helps grant understanding of what needs to be transformed. Even schools can teach children how to deal with anger and reconcile conflicts. Did any of you have a class on how to deal with conflicts? Any classes? Anybody teach you about that? Even when you were a child? That's cool if you did. I can't recall a class that I had on that. But oftentimes, the signs that we are taught, the labels of things that we're taught in school, end up creating separation and fool us into thinking that anything outside of us can be used, can be exploited for our own gain and pleasure. These limited resources, the scarcity mindset, these resources must be fought over. And beyond signs, beyond labels, there is no fear and no blame. There's no fear and no blame. The environment and the universe is simply an extension of our being, and to protect the elements that contribute to the diversity in creation is to protect ourselves. One of the key sutras about this is the Diamond Sutra, which enumerates the 4 signs, which is the self, the person, the living being, the lifespan. And we'll get more into that when we do our sutra class, hopefully within my lifetime. Crossing my fingers. Priority, Zach. Make it happen. The last one here is aimlessness. So nothing to do, no program, no agenda, no method, no certification, no degrees. That's the main crux of aimlessness. It's the pressures of our culture, our society that drive us to want to succeed, to achieve, the feeling that you're not good enough and that you have to be able to prove your own value. Aimlessness is saying you don't have to do that. You don't have to feel pressured. You don't have to feel like you need to be anything other than what you are as a human being, as a life form. The purpose of a rose is to what? To be a scientist, an engineer, a lawyer. No. The purpose of a rose is just to be a rose. You don't have to run anywhere to become someone else. You are a miracle, just as you are. How many other planets out there do you know of that have as many life forms as we do? It's a miracle that we're even here. When you think about all of the causes that had to take place just for the Earth to have an ocean, an ecosystem, breathable air, an atmosphere. I mean, it was a rare circumstance that the Earth could even support life, and yet here we are. It's a miracle. That's why Thich Nhat Hanh says the miracle isn't to walk on water, it's just to be able to walk on land. Even that is profound. Happiness can be touched in this very moment. You just have the right perspective. Enlightenment is already within us. You don't have to search for it anywhere else. You think you have to clock in 1,000 hours of meditation just to be able to touch happiness? So don't make today a means to an end. You have 24 hours to enjoy living fully in each moment. Don't waste it. Without happiness, if we carry worry and anxiety in our hearts, it cannot be a refuge for others. What am I waiting for to make me happy? Why am I not happy right now? What's holding me back? So contemplate the barriers to your own happiness. What's preventing you from being present? What's preventing you from making the most out of what time you have left? So now we get into just this little tidbit here that Thich Nhat Hanh included in these chapters, which is how to know if a teaching represents a correct understanding of the Dharma. So first and foremost, the two relevances. So the relevance to the essence. When we talk about the essence, we're talking about what we just talked about. The Dharma seals and the doors of liberation. This is the essence of the teachings. So if you present a teaching or a piece of the Dharma or a sutra to a group or audience, if they relate to what we just talked about, with the doors of liberation and the Dharma seals, that is a demonstration of the correct understanding that you may have of the Dharma. Relevance to the circumstance. The teachings are relatable and accessible and relevant to your audience. Know your audience. Can they relate to what you're saying? I'll give an example of this. She's probably going to watch this video, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. So Mom, I love you, but I'm going to talk about this real quick. So my mother's very into Vedic astrology, okay? So when I talk to her on the phone, when she starts talking about Vedic astrology, she doesn't tell it to me in a way that I can really understand or grasp. And it's using terminology that I'm not familiar with. So everything that she's talking about just goes way over my head. And I have to constantly ask her, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? Help me understand what that means, right? And so when you're speaking about something that might be important to you, like the Dharma or these teachings, just make sure that it's presented in a way that they can understand you. Be careful about terms that you use, or what they might call quote-unquote Dharma speak, because it might fly over people's heads. And the 4 standards. So the worldly is speak in accordance to the language of worldly matters. Could be relating it to current events in a way, something that's happening in the times right now. Right, so not some like distant ethereal realm or like superstitious beliefs or what have you, but like what's happening in the world right now, right? Not some spirit world, but like the actual ecosystem that we're a part of here. Oops. And then the person, speaking with an understanding of the listener. So it might take just asking the right questions. What are they interested in? What brings them here? What questions might they have about it? Right? So just understand what is their aim, what is their interest, so that you can present the information or the Dharma in a way that it helps get to the heart of what they're wondering about. And then healing, speaking to express healing of a particular illness. What we mean by that is what types of issues are we seeing in the world today, or perhaps amongst humanity or within ourselves. What type of illness is present there that we need to heal? How can the Dharma help facilitate healing of that illness? I just talked about things like the myth of normal and the perpetuation of trauma, right? So illness, right? The Dharma can assist with that through signlessness, right? And compassion. Okay? So that's an example of that. And then the absolute, expressing absolute truth without doubt. Absolute truth, what we mean by that was the ultimate reality. Reality without signs. Reality without concepts, preferences, beliefs, right? It's just touching reality as it is without projecting any particular belief on top of it. So that might mean sticking with, if you're a journalist, sticking with the, what's the word I'm looking for? It starts with an O. But it's basically not getting stuck in your own bias, right? Just presenting the facts, right? That's a good way of looking at it. Oftentimes, the lines get blurred between your own opinions and what facts are. See that more and more today. They give their opinion and they say hashtag facts, right? Be careful about that. Objectivity. Thanks, Jenny. That's exactly what I was trying to think of. Be as objective as possible. So one way of thinking about that is just sticking with your observances of things. So when I have an argument with somebody or a debate, right, I try to stick with just what happened, what I observed. This is what I observed, right? And try to leave as much of my opinions or blaming or judgment out of it, right? That's a way to help us touch absolute reality to the best degree that we can, regardless of the limitations that we have with our own brains and the ability to understand the complexities of the universe. Okay. Now the 4 reliances. So the reliance on the teaching. Don't rely on the teacher. Because the teacher often does not practice what they preach. Sometimes they do. But unless you're around them 24/7, chances are they're probably not going to adhere to their teachings 100%. Right? They might mess up every now and then. I've heard stories of even Thich Nhat Hanh himself getting angry and lashing out at people. Right? It's happened. So even the most renowned and revered Zen teachers can slip up from time to time. Now, expectations of them can be so great that we're setting up ourselves for disappointment. And then we start to doubt the teacher, and then we doubt the teachings because they don't fulfill these expectations we have, right? We're not allowing that person to be human. So instead, rely on the teaching. Don't get stuck in this guru-disciple mindset. Don't start worshiping people, right? This is where we fall off the path. Reliance on the absolute truth, similar to what we said with that fourth standard, right? Focusing on discourses that discuss the absolute truth, not relative truth. Although Thich Nhat Hanh has issues with this one because relative truth can help us understand the absolute. Just like when we talked about earlier, about the standard of worldly things, relevance to the circumstance, these tend to be associated with relative truth. So sometimes you can use both. You can use relative truth to help people understand the absolute, right? Reliance on the meaning, not getting caught in words, but understanding of the overall context and circumstances of a teaching. So again, not getting caught in concepts, because if you do, Master Lin Chi is going to smack you, right? So he's going to bark at you. So don't get caught in the words themselves. Sometimes we can go on and on about definitions of things and how we understand the word to mean, but not somebody else does. Step back a second, take a more wider view of what those words are actually trying to teach us. And then finally, reliance on insight, looking deeply rather than discriminating. Looking deeply into the nature of things, trying to understand the nature of things, rather than trying to separate things out into bits and pieces and put them into boxes and labels and blah, blah, right? Now, granted, the scientific method tends to do these things, and it's not to say that they're bad, right? It's a way of trying to understand reality with the scientific method and putting things into boxes with labels. However, we tend to get caught into those labels, right? So we need to step back from time to time and take a wider view and try not to discriminate, try not to separate things, but rather, what's the overall picture? What's the bigger picture?